Rights First has a long-standing and fruitful partnership with many retired military leaders who have teamed up with us to push for national security policies that respect human rights. Some people have called this a strange bedfellow alliance, but to me, it's always seemed quite natural. The military is a values-driven institution that believes in rules and accountability. We have found common cause with many in the military who share our belief that protecting human rights goes hand in hand with protecting our country. More than 20 years ago, when I was a young staffer at Human Rights First, my very first trip for the organization was as a guest of Southcom, Southern Command. Back then, General Barry McCaffrey wanted to bring human rights lawyers like me down to Panama to see firsthand how the military was dealing with Cuban refugees it was detaining there. General McCaffrey welcomed scrutiny and dialogue. Which brings me to our next guest, General John Kelly, who now heads up Southcom, his latest assignment in a distinguished 4-decade career in the Marine Corps. General Kelly is the only regional combatant commander who has a human rights office, and as he travels through his region, he makes a point of meeting with human rights organizations and activists. He has spoken out about the scourge of human trafficking and the threat that the drug trade poses to human rights in the region. And he's been outspoken about the need for militaries to respect human rights. He has worked with militaries in Latin America to guard against abusive tactics that undermine their mission. Revered by those who serve under him, General Kelly is an exceptional member of an exceptional generation that has done so much for our country. We are very honored to have him with us. Please join me in welcoming General John Kelly.
Well, thanks very much. I was notified just as we walked in the door a few minutes ago that we're a little short on time, so I'm going to, rather than deliver or read a speech, I'll work off my notes, and I think the best part of any of these kind of events are the Q&A, so we'll save some time for that for sure. And as I mentioned I will answer any question I can consistent with security clearance and policy. As you may or may not know, people in serving the U.S. military don't make policy, we execute it. We ask our opinion sometimes on policy, but at the end of the day, it is not my place to pass too much judgment on policy. Glad to be here. Really, thanks for the invitation to speak. It may seem strange, as Alyssa said, in the conversation that you have a military person talking about human rights, but I would tell you, and I hope I don't offend anyone, that there's a lot of people on this earth that talk about human rights, and that's a good thing, and everyone that talks about human rights is doing exactly the right thing. But the U.S. military, throughout our history, does human rights. It is fundamental to who we are. It is fundamental to how we operate. I don't need a lawyer to tell me what human rights are. I know what it is because I was raised properly. My mother taught me about how to deal with people, and entering the military in my whole life in the military has been one devoted to first and foremost human rights. Everything we do in Southern Command, and as Alyssa mentioned, down in Southern Command, we are the only, in fact, they're small but powerful, but my human rights team is here. The United States Southern Command, one of 5 overseas commands that our nation has. Our team is the only combatant command that has a dedicated human rights office. And as I say, they're small, but they're extremely powerful. And they have connections throughout not only the U.S. end of the human rights community, but also down in the various countries that we interact in. So as I say, we don't just talk about it, we do it. And I will not deal with anyone, nor will my people deal with anyone that is trying to BS us relative to how they treat their people. I've got a lot of experience in Iraq. I've got a lot of experience in a lot of different places. This isn't anything new to me. As I said, from the day I became a private in the Marine Corps, left the enlisted ranks as a sergeant, became a second lieutenant all the way up through 4 stars. It is what we do in the military, and from the very, very beginning, all through our careers, we're trained to first and foremost think about what we're going to do, whether it's deliver artillery fires, airstrikes or simply engage in a country in Latin America, that everything we do be done legally and according to the law of war, obviously, but most importantly, that we're doing the right thing. Dialogue is hugely important to me. In fact, I'll meet with a large group tomorrow. Since I've been the combatant commander, about once every 4 or 5 months up here in Washington, we have a roundtable, human rights roundtable. Some of you may be there. A couple hours we spend together, a cup of coffee and a croissant. And I don't actually have the croissant. I have the Dunkin' Donuts, but that's my background. But we sit and talk about issues. And frankly, when someone talks to me about an issue in Guatemala, Honduras, Colombia, I'll run it down for them and try to report back. But that's one thing I do. But just as importantly, maybe more importantly, almost every time I visit a country in my part of the world that I deal with, my partners, I will take some time out to meet with local human rights groups in the full gambit, from indigenous human rights groups, or people that look out for the indigenous folks that live in these various countries, LGBT, women's rights, the whole gambit. And sometimes, frankly, we were talking coming over with Joe in the car, sometimes we get a little different view, or maybe a very different view down in the countries themselves than I sometimes get in Washington. Don't know how to square that circle, but the point is I want to dialogue with everyone, even the difficult ones. I remember not too long ago in one of the Central American countries, human rights representative indigenous, came at me, was hostile in the extreme. U.S. military is nothing but bad. You shouldn't be here. Why are you here? And this might surprise you, but the vast majority of what we do in the Caribbean and Latin America, and I mean the vast majority, has nothing to do with guns, nothing to do with fighting, patrolling, teaching them tactics. It's overwhelmingly humanitarian assistance and teaching them things like disaster relief in the event of an earthquake or a hurricane, and frankly, engineering work where we'll fix a school, drill a well, fix a dam. Very, very little, in the big scheme of things, very, very little what most people would think of as military. Challenges in the region, various challenges. The good news is democracy. In many, many places where there hasn't been a tradition of democracy is growing. One thing that does cause me a great deal of concern, some countries are backsliding. I won't get into which ones, you know who they are, but they've gone from being fairly democratic over the last 10 or 15 years, 20 years, and now seem to be backsliding a little bit for various reasons. We partner with any country that wants to partner with us, with the exception of Cuba. The only country that I'm restricted from dealing with, don't want to get into the politics of it, is Cuba. But everybody else we will partner with. We don't partner with everyone, but we will partner with them. And actually I have pretty good military to military, even with those countries that are a little cool to us. We have pretty good mill-to-mill discussions. They come to our conferences, ask us for advice. I'll even send, say, training teams down to help them instruct. Here's a good one: instruct their militaries, their police, their security forces in human rights. Believe it or not, many countries in the region really yearn for that type of training. Another type of training I would give some of the countries that are a little bit cool to us would be, say, a training team to go down there and help them fix their Coast Guard type boats, diesel boats. So in the event of, sea air rescue, that kind of thing. We work very closely with even the countries that are cool to us in those kind of humanitarian assistance type ways. But it is a challenging place, particularly in terms of the drug flow. I probably don't have to tell anyone in this room that there's a huge amount of violence and corruption in many of the countries, particularly up to Central American Isthmus, almost entirely due, at least at the beginning, to the drug demand in the United States. Virtually every gram of cocaine that is used in the United States comes up from Colombia through the Isthmus, trafficked through the Isthmus, up through Mexico into the United States. 100% of the heroin, the same thing. Produced and trafficked from Central America, Mexico into the United States. 87% of the methamphetamines. And what that means to the countries that are not consumer countries to any great degree, and I haven't mentioned marijuana and won't, but to many of the consumer countries, what that means to the countries, the transport countries, unbelievable levels of corruption, and if they can't buy people off, whether it's a cop or a president, then they try to kill them. And largely due to, as I say, our drug consumption in the United States. But I think I have to give some of them some credit. This might be controversial in some cases, but certainly our own president, President Obama, Vice President Biden, and the State Department have come to the same conclusion I'm about to state, and that is we have a window of opportunity, particularly in Central America right now. The three countries that are most at risk are also are led by reasonably effective presidents that have reasonable, that are clean, and I believe have the right attitudes towards human rights. Very, very difficult for them to change what a lot of people are doing in their country relative to human rights and drug trafficking and person trafficking. But I do believe that we have a window of opportunity with these three presidents, and we're doing the best we can to work with them within the law and within human rights, what I consider to be the requirements for human rights interaction. And we're making some progress, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. One particular thing I wanted to note, Guatemala. Went to Guatemala. I frequent Guatemala, went there recently. I'd heard about Freddie Pecorelli, interesting guy. He runs the forensic lab. It's essentially a private lab in Guatemala, some funding from the government, not much. Freddie came to the United States as a 9-year-old. He was born in Guatemala, educated in the United States, grew up in Brooklyn of all places, and he's a forensic anthropologist. He now, with a very small team, is exhuming mass graves all over Guatemala, attempting to identify what the skeletal remains, and they're doing very good work in this, and then contacting the families and delivering the remains over time. And they're also building legal cases as they do this. In his lab, probably 20 or 30 very, very dedicated people, all of them were working while I was there, and this is all they do day in and day out, working on cleaning up the, everywhere, every table had remains on them, some of them very, very small children, some of them clearly women, all of them skeletal. They do tremendous work. And I do want to give you the website, because if you don't know about it, or if you want to contribute to something that's doing great work, Freddie is the man. www.fafg.org. That's www.fafg.org. It's a heroic effort, and my belief, certainly I wouldn't think I'd get an argument in this room. My belief is, as positive in many ways as things are today in some of these countries, they have horrific backgrounds in terms of human rights violations. And as I tell their presidents, their chiefs of defense, their generals, their admirals, their ministers of defense, you simply cannot ignore your past. You have to reconcile the past. Guatemala, to use that example, 200,000 people, roughly, almost entirely killed by government forces. They can't not reconcile themselves to that. It was 30 years ago, 35 years ago. Vast majority of the people that did it are either very old men or dead. There's no soldiers in those units anymore that were in those units 35 years ago. But in order to turn the page, you have to reconcile. And that is my message to them. And we're making some progress in this. It's not fast. Rome wasn't built in a day. But they know what my position is. And there's a great many things that I won't do in some of these countries until they start the process of being more engaged on this issue. And as I say, I think even the State, well, not even, but the State Department would agree that we're making some progress here. And interestingly enough, and maybe more importantly, the human rights groups that are there in those countries have told me that the logjam is starting to break up. So Freddie is quite a hero. If you travel to that part of the world at all, I really highly recommend you drop in and see what they're doing. It's, to say the least, it's important work. Maybe I'll just get to a conclusion here, listen, and then we can open it up, sit down and open it up. this topic of human rights, and I'll circle back to where I started. From the U.S. military point of view, there have been, unquestionably, there have been abuses within the U.S. military. I mean, My Lai, my generation, the Vietnam generation coming up, My Lai is an obvious one. Haditha Dam, for us that wear the Marine uniform. A number of others that from this war. But at the end of the day, as I tell and it's resonated with the leadership in some of these, all of these countries that I deal with. At the end of the day, and I will end with this. At the end of the day, it's not that an event happened, whether it's My Lai or Haditha Dam. It's not that the event happened. If you've never been to combat, and I don't mean been in uniform and been in Iraq, I mean really been in combat, it's impossible to understand what you go through, what the young men and the young women go through. It's impossible, and it wears you down over time. There's no excuse for violating human rights to do these atrocities. There's never an excuse to violate human rights and to do atrocities. And again, there's no excuse, but there is an explanation, but you can't even understand the explanation unless you've really been in combat. But in any event, we have a zero tolerance, but we don't have a perfect record. But as I tell the leadership, it is what you do when you suspect it, or when you have a case. You have to, institutionally, you have to look into it. You can't turn a blind eye to it. As much as you don't want to go after your soldiers, your Marines, and prosecute them, you have to do it. You cannot cover it up. And in fact, it's almost impossible to cover up things these days anyways. And at the end of the day, a court of law or a court-martial will certainly give the individual that's accused his or her day in court, so to speak. But as I point out to them again and again and again, it's not the fact that you have a violation or that you have a soldier that got out of hand or a cop that did something wrong. It's how the institution responds to it. And if you cover it up, if you investigate it and really hold people accountable, then people will give you credit for that. If you don't investigate, if you do try to cover it up, you will eventually get caught. And then no one will, it just takes away from the credibility of your organization. But as I say, when I talk to them about human rights, I frequently use, not their human rights record, but frequently use our human rights record and make the points I've just made to you, and typically use, say, My Lai. If you don't know anything about it, I can certainly get into that, or Haditha Dam, and several other instances from this war that have been on the front pages. So Lester, I guess I'll stop there. That'll save us a little time, and I will sit down, I guess, with you now, and we'll talk.
Great.
Good here?
Yep. Good. We have just about 10 minutes, but I want to use it wisely. I have a bunch of questions myself. But let me just first say thank you so much for that, for your work and for your remarks and for being here. A couple of things that you said reminded me, as we are dealing with our own history in the interrogation area this week and kind of taking time to look at our own mistakes. It's one of the things that a military interrogator told me about 10 years ago when we started looking at this. Something you said about how you were raised brought it home to me. He said, what my rule of thumb is when I'm doing an interrogation? My mama always told me, he said, if you have to ask if something is right, then don't do it, because your gut will tell you. Your gut will tell you. And I was always, I found, I had never read the Army Field Manual on interrogations before any of this happened. And when I read it, I was struck so much by how that principle of essentially the golden rule was right there in black and white. And when the history of all of this is written, I think what we know will become much more common knowledge, and that is that many of the heroes of the fight for our values during that terrible, anxious time were people who wore the uniform, lawyers and non-lawyers. So I want to just highlight that for you. And now I will open it up to questions, and I want you to tell me when I run out of time, because I know we have a lot to talk about. I have so many, so I'm going to jump in if somebody doesn't raise their hand. Okay, here we go. Please identify yourself first.
Hi, General Kelly. Thanks for a great talk. So you said that SOCOM is the only regional combatant command with a human rights office. Do you think that's a missed opportunity for all the other regional combatant commands? And what would you advocate could maybe be shared from SOCOM?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I think the reason this Southern Command has probably, 15 or 20 years ago, Joe, Leanne, I don't know how long ago, but it's quite a while. It wasn't my idea, by the way. It's a great idea, though. I wish I had it. I think it's because the unique aspect of Latin America, Central America, and the Caribbean. The other combatant commands you might think of as warfighting commands. Obviously, Central Command involved in a war now. European Command, just this side of peace, believe me, with Russia and the Ukraine. What's going on in Africa, I think probably Africa would be better served to have a standalone. It's not to say that the other combatant commanders don't care about human rights. I just think it was unique to this because of the history particularly of the Civil War period, the civil wars during the 80s, and I think as democracy came to places like Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and the rest of the area, the isthmus, I think it made sense because those countries were coming out of some pretty tough human rights times, and I think probably someone that sat in my seat 15 or 20 years ago said, this would make sense as these militaries come out of the Pinochet era or whatever, that we help them get their heads straight relative to human rights.
Any other questions out there? Oh, there's one way in the back. Wait for the mic. It's coming.
Sitting up here, it's kind of looking directly into the sun.
I can't honestly see, so sorry. Excuse me for doing this, but I can't see you.
Thank you. My name's Jillian Burns. I'm a recently retired Foreign Service officer. General, I had a question. Are you seeing what you would see as positive trends in the foreign militaries of the countries you cover towards accountability within their own ranks, so that when there are abuses, there is accountability for them?
I am. One of the things that frankly surprised me was the polling, independent polling in much of the part of the world I work with. The militaries are, in fact, the most respected, the most admired, and considered to be the most effective parts of the government. That sounds good, and it is good, but you have to temper that a little bit with the idea that their police are almost entirely ineffective, their court systems are almost entirely ineffective, their governments are almost entirely ineffective. But the polling, much like in our own country, with the exception down south of the Catholic Church, the military is almost, as I say, considered the most respected, admired, effective, and the people want them on the street. Now, a lot of that has to do with the fact that the police, as I say, are so ineffective, are so corrupt. So that tells me something about how the military are behaving. When I send troops down into which is fairly frequent, small numbers, mostly not combat troops, very seldom, they're always debriefed when they come back to the States. Hey, how did the local Guatemalans or the Colombians, how did they interact with the local people in the villages? Were they, did the people shy away? Were they? So all in all, I would say, very anecdotal almost, but I would have to say that they seem to get it. When there is a violation, I can certainly speak for my time in the job. When there's a violation or an alleged violation, they get after it. One of the great fears military people have, commanders have in combat, is that the folks that they command will not be given a fair shake if they do something wrong. Or an investigation might be more of a witch hunt than an investigation. So that's something we talk to the commanders about a lot. I have some examples in my own time where it broke my heart when people that work for me covered up events. And then when we investigated it and talked to the individual, it revolved around, sir, I didn't think my guys, my Marines, would get a fair shake. Yes, they shot the people, but it was and that breaks my heart when they didn't trust me enough to know that I would do the right thing after the investigation. But to answer your question, I think they do. If you live down in these countries and we're in the village, and you may not see it the same way, but from a macro view, they do, and frequently, not frequently, but occasionally, I'll know something and wait and see if they do something, and if they don't, I might call and say, hey, by the way, I'd heard about an event in a given village on the Caribbean coast. But overall, I think baby steps, but better and better. There's one?
Yep. Ah, that's one of ours.
Hi, my name's Eleanor Acer. I'm actually the director of the refugee program here at Human Rights First. And I'm curious to hear a little bit about the work you all are doing on migrant issues in Central America. There have been some disturbing reports that some of the migrant interception activities by military in the region or border guards have not included essential human rights protections or appropriate referral mechanisms for people fleeing persecution, for example. Yeah. Be curious to just get your thoughts, if there's anything specifically you can say about efforts to promote human rights for migrants and for refugees fleeing from violence and persecution. Thank you.
Yeah, again, another good question. I'm not that much into at DOD. I generally spend most of my time doing things that are frankly none of my business, and most of the interagency tell me that I should get out of their business, that it's their business. And I said, yeah, but you're not doing it. And so until you do, I'll do it. I got plenty of time on my hands. But one of the things in terms of migrants and refugees, out of the part of the world that I deal with most frequently, generally speaking, when people want to leave, they go. Unfortunately, right now, there's almost no reason, in my mind, why you would want to stay in some of these countries, just because the level of violence. Honduras is the highest murder rate in the world by UN standards. Violence, totally corrupt law enforcement institutions, that kind of thing. But people still stay. It's where they live. But give them a reason to move, and they will go. And of course, we all saw that 68,000 children this summer, more or less this summer, made it into the United States pretty easily. And although it's not the most pleasant trip, to say the least, generally speaking, as Hondurans told me, and I talked to some of the people in the interagency about this, because they wanted us to kind of have a public relations campaign to tell them, the mothers and fathers of the Central American countries, hey, it's a dangerous trip. You're being ripped off. The coyotes are going to take your money, and that's typical Washington. With all due, no, I don't mean any respect. Typical Washington. Tell them this. But as I told even some very senior people in our government just the other night, it's not what we say in Washington. It's what they hear in El Salvador, or what they hear in Haiti. And we can say, no, but it's what they hear. So during the UAC crisis, they started moving, and the parents told me about 2 weeks after the child left, they then got a phone call, and the child would say, look, I'm in a place called Texas. Tomorrow they're sending me to a place called Boston. I'm already in English classes. I'm getting 3 meals a day, and I'm being well taken care of. That's music to the ears of a parent whose child has probably got very little chance in life. And as soon as they go through the legal process, they'll either be allowed to stay or come back. What I can tell you is, though, when we did work with particularly the northern tier countries of Central America, and with the presidents and with their first ladies, were very active. We did do public relations campaigns to at least educate everybody about there is some danger in the process, particularly young women. They may get to the United States. They will be taken care of in a humane way, but the chances are they won't be able to stay over time. But interesting enough, and I was just talking to some of our border people the other day, since our presidents executive order, and I mentioned this to, again, some very senior people I won't share, that when our president did the executive action, our border, Mexican border now, are just starting to pick up illegal migrants who heard what the president said, not what he meant, heard what the president said, interpreted it in their way, and they think, and they're starting to arrive now on the border, they think if they can get in, they can stay. It's not what the president said, it's not what he did, but that's what they heard. But generally speaking, when we return migrants or illegal individuals from the states, we haven't any the children yet, just what's so-called family units. We work with them in the 3 countries in question that we work with the most, with most of the migrants. They've got a pretty good reintegration program, but at the end of the day, they're still going back to their village in Honduras with not a lot of opportunity right now for education, safety, that kind of thing. But probably the State Department would have a much better answer in terms of the actual refugee process than I do. But we do the best we can to, we always, when we pick them up, treat them right. And again, I think we're having a positive influence on the countries, not by lecturing them, but by just working with them. I can't underscore enough. The U.S. military working with a country, our security forces, they just get better because of what we do and what they see us do. They just get better. They get more proficient at drilling wells or doing engineer projects. They get more proficient or more effective in terms of working with the civilian population.
It's a strong argument for engagement between military engagement, but it does put a burden on the United States military to ensure that, as you said, when you see things or hear of things that are concerning, because we will be seen to be affiliated with that, and people look to us for on the refugee issues. One of the things that we're concerned about so much is there's certainly what they call a mixed flow of people, right? There are going to be people coming over the border who are fleeing just the kind of violence and persecution that you talked about in your remarks, and who may be entitled to refugee status. But that we have to have a process that will sort that out, and we want to make sure that that happens. It's a big resource drain for us, but it's something that is a big part of who we are. So I think we might have time for one more question if we have one. Yep.
There you
go. Okay.
I knew you'd ask a question.
Hi, Jeff Abramson, work on human rights and weapons issues. In the last 15 years or so, the military has been asked to take on a lot of new responsibilities. We can consider Afghanistan and Iraq. The U.S. doesn't do nation building, but the United States military was asked to do nation building in those countries in a lot of ways. And the assessment now doesn't look so good. But you've got a command that does a lot of, as you say, a lot of the non-combatant work. And I've been disturbed by some trends I see within our government of putting a lot more money in security assistance funds that are then run by the military that might have in the past been run out of state or AID. There's just sort of a shift of responsibilities into the military. Wondering if you think these problems are beyond what the military can do, but how the military is doing and what you think the balance of working across agencies or with other players is going, and suggestions you might have or things you've learned, especially in a place where you're not necessarily dealing with the combatant side.
The U.S. military is very, very, very good at anything and everything the U.S. government, the President of the United States, tells us to do. We can do anything. Our culture is one of a bias for action, of not being tied down by who's really in charge of the thing. I can give you 1,000 examples of my time in Iraq, where economic development. The Sunni part of Iraq was a place when I went back as a commander. They said, look, you can't win down there. It's a hotbed of Sunni radicalism. just don't get too many people killed. Anbar province. We won in Anbar province. And when I say we won, we made common cause with the sheikhs, we beat down Al Qaeda, and we developed the place in a way that no one could believe in terms of agricultural production, in terms of industry, and all this kind of thing. So I'm a Marine, and I'm going up the normal way to get this kind of assistance to Baghdad. People in Baghdad that never traveled outside of the green zone and didn't understand what was going on the ground. And a couple of examples I would give you. I grew up in Boston, city kid. People came up to me and said, Anbar province used to produce more chickens for obviously all the things you use chickens for, but more chickens than anywhere else in the Middle East. But because of the oil for food program, all of that kind of thing went away because they pumped oil and they were given food. So the chicken, that employed really large numbers of people. And so the chickens and the sheep and all of this kind of thing. And so I said to Baghdad, I really need people that know agriculture because there's things here that with tremendous potential, but I want to kickstart it. And after waiting 2 months, I get 4 or 5 people from the Department of Agriculture that didn't know anything about agriculture. They were bureaucrats from Washington, but they were no better at chickens than I am, and chickens to me you get in a grocery store. So what we did was I just bypassed it, and I went to the best agricultural school in the world, Texas A&M University, and I said, I need someone that knows, again, I'm a city kid, I need someone that knows how to bring back what was once a very vibrant agricultural economy. And they sent 9 or 10 people. It cost me $400,000. They came for 3.5 months, and I remember the day they reported out to me. There was a woman that said, we had 5 million sheep in Anbar province. And she said, every one of them's got to be replaced. And I went, okay, I'm thinking, where will I buy 5 million sheep? And she said, you must be from Boston in the city. Because no, you don't have to buy 5 million sheep. What we need is 15,000 rams. And what you do is you go around, and we did this. We went around, and when we saw a flock of sheep, people that know what rams look like, I have a general idea how to identify a ram. But say, okay, you got 3 rams. Cut their throats right now and eat them, obviously, and we'll give you 3 new rams. We bought these rams from all over the Middle East and North Africa. What we were doing was replacing the DNA stock because they were all inbred and very sickly and all that. So my point is, anyways, $400,000. They come in, a guy that knows soil, irrigation, better irrigation techniques, 1 million chicks we bought and started 1 million chicks to start the chicken production program. I was criticized repeatedly over getting outside my lane. But the agricultural industry in Anbar province came back, and many, many thousands of young men were employed, gave them something to do, and life goes on. Same kind of comments, economic development. I had a lot of reservists work for me. I queried all of my Marine reservists and said, does anyone know anything about business development? I had 10 or 12 people who were very, very skilled at it. So we sent them down to Kuwait to today's man, bought them a couple of cheap suits, and sent them down to Qatar, Amman, Jordan, a few other places in that part of the world. And the next thing you know, I'm flying businessmen from other parts of the Persian Gulf, Arab businessmen, in Marine aircraft up to Anbar province to have meetings with Sunni sheikhs and Anbar businessmen to kickstart it. Not overnight, very quickly, the economy started to pick up. All of this outside of my lane, all of this outside of the AID process, and I can't say enough good things about AID, but all of it because they're bound by this kind of, they have baggage. A book, and I'll end with this, a really, really good book that I'd recommend to you if you're interested in economic development, that kind of thing. Paul Brinkley the name of the book is Warfront to Storefront. Paul was a very, very successful businessman, hired by Rumsfeld. He's still a good guy. Brinkley, I mean. And he came out and for 5 years was the DOD business development guy. and what he touched got better. Severely criticized by the establishment, because what's DOD doing in nation building and economic development? And the answer is because you're not doing it. So we are very, very good at what we do. And I would offer that the idea that the U.S. military, if the mission is business development, like it was in Anbar Province, it was more business development than killing people. We know how to do that really well. But it was more business development and sitting down with sheikhs and human rights issues and all of that. We're very, very good at that. We're not tied by the baggage that the federal bureaucracies or the other bureaucracies are. And at the end of the day, we have this bias for action. We want to put points on the board, and we want to win the game.
Another trait that we share with the military. Thank you so
Sure.
much, General Kelly. It's really been a pleasure talking with you.